Well, it's always just such a great pleasure to welcome you to our 50-50 monthly discussions, to see you popping in from all around the world and to see familiar faces and this time some new faces. And because we've got a lot of newcomers today, just allow me a few words on our Pass It On network. The Pass It On network is a global network of positive aging pioneers advocating for older people's rights and contributing to the adaptation of society to the challenges of longevity. 223 is our 10th anniversary, and we're celebrating it with pioneers in 65 different countries around the world, all confronting the challenges of demographic changes. We publish a monthly newsletter and we have our monthly 50-50 conversations. And if you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, please do so as soon as this is over. And I'm now going to hand back to Osnat, who's going to set the context for our exchange today. Osnat, over to you.
Well, thank you, Moira. Yes. So we have a very pertinent topic today. I'm sure that this is why all of you are here, just to learn about it. Environmental disasters don't wait for you to be ready. They just hit. And we're witnessing it day to day. Just recently, in the last 12 months, we had Maui in Hawaii with the devastating fires. We had Libya, we had Greece, we have Morocco with floods, with earthquakes, Turkey, Fukushima in Japan, South Africa, Canada, a lot of wildfires, floods, and all kinds of things that we don't call natural disasters anymore. We call them environmental disasters because it's part of the environment that we are living in and created. And the primary concern that we want to bring today is in preparing older adults to disasters. And older adults are more vulnerable in physical, emotional, and logistic challenges during these kind of crises. Older individuals also grapple with the mobility issues, with the accessibility to medications, accessibility to medical care anyway, and difficulty to maintain social support networks, and all that is making emergencies a lot more daunting. Today, we are delighted to welcome Femada Shamam, who is just last year in South Africa, had a first-hand experience with 2 major flooding disasters. And she brings that personal experience and also being a CEO of TAFTA, the Association for the Aged in Durban. And Femada is also a long-time Pastor Network member, a true pioneer. And I'm passing it on to you, Femada, to tell us, what shall we do?
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everyone from South Africa. So it's 7 p.m., so it's evening on our side. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. And I think perhaps maybe as an introduction as to why we're having this conversation, I'll just tell you a little bit of a story. So at the beginning of September, I met a couple of people in Glasgow for the Global Aging Conference, and it was held as a collaborative conference with the Global Aging Network, the NCF, the National Care Forum, and Scottish Care. And there were a number of different aspects we looked at in terms of sustainable care and support to older persons. And while we were there, and just as we were leaving, the incident in Morocco happened. And I remember watching all of the visuals that were coming through, and it was really heartbreaking to see the impact of the earthquake in Morocco. And one of the ones that really resonated or impacted on me was watching an older person trying to leave their home, and the younger person was trying to help them down some stairs, and this utter look of frustration was something that really tugged to my heartstrings about people's preparedness for these disasters. So I posted a LinkedIn a piece just saying, I feel for the people in Morocco in terms of what's happening, but it also has us thinking about what can we do in terms of disaster preparedness. And Osnet picked up on that conversation, and the rest is history. We had a conversation and said, perhaps this is something that we can talk about. So that's just context about why we're having this and where it's coming from. So today I'm going to do a little bit of a slideshow. So I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay. Osnet, you're going to tell me whether or not you can see it. Okay. Are you able
Yes,
to see?
we can.
Okay. So as Osnet had indicated, we experienced some flooding in South Africa in 2022 in April and in May. And these are visuals from the situation we found ourselves in South Africa due to the flooding. It didn't discriminate. It impacted on every single part of our society, whether it was an informal settlement, whether it was an upmarket area, whether it was the street or whether it was a petrol station. Every single part of Durban was impacted. And to date, we still have a number of issues with regards to the floods, and the infrastructure has been severely compromised. But it did cut us off from services. It also brought to the fore the importance of having some kind of disaster preparedness plan. From the perspective of older persons, because I work in that sector, these disasters in April and in May last year spurred us on to have an emergency communication plan. And towards the end of last year, we finalized that plan. So in times of disaster, these are some of the things we need to be communicating and who we need to be communicating that to. But disaster preparedness is not just about the communication. There's a whole lot of different things that we need to be considering. So today I just want to share with you some information that I found interesting. So when we had this discussion, I started reading up on a number of things and just getting my head around the quantum of what we were dealing with. And I must say that I was quite surprised as I was doing the research, and I'm going to share some of this with you. So I'm just going to go on to the next slide. So there's an interesting report, and you can find this on the net. It's called Emergency Events Database, and they produce a report on, well, not natural disaster. I'm going to call it environmental disasters, as Osnet indicated. And I'm going to just take you through some of the things from 2022. So last year, what are some of the things that they have indicated? Now, this is one of the figures that I found very interesting. 387 reported environmental disasters, 387. So while we talk about one or two, when you look at the quantum of what the world is experiencing from an environmental perspective, it really, really humbles you into thinking about how we should be prepared for these kinds of numbers. They also break it down in terms of where we're finding majority of these disasters. You'll see the Americas accounted for 118, Asia 137, and in Africa we looked at 79. What's interesting is the different types of environmental disasters that they speak about, and you see the major is around flooding, but there's also a significant amount in terms of the storms. And as we go on to the next slide, I'll just quickly take you through that. When we look at the human impact of these disasters, you'll see that a significant number of people, 30,000 people, had lost their lives due to these environmental disasters. Of that, you'll see that almost 5,000 people were in Africa, 16,000 in Europe, 1,600 in Americas. One of the things that I found quite interesting as well is this issue around extreme temperature. And they recorded these events, especially in Europe, in terms of the heat waves that existed. So while we talk about these quick environmental disasters like your storms, there's also the slow impact disasters like your droughts and the heat waves that's impacting on older persons. And we need to be thinking about how do we prepare for these things, because it's not a one-off event. It's something that's happening over a period of time as well. Then part of this report also looked at the human impact and the total number of people that were affected by these 300-odd environmental disasters. And you'll see, I was particularly interested in Africa because that's where I'm based. And you'll see that the impact on Africa accounts for almost 60% of the total impact. So you're really starting to see the impact of these disasters on low to middle income countries. And you'll see that the other significant impact is on Asia as well. These graphs makes for very interesting reading, but this is the one that I found very interesting as well. In terms of the droughts, you'll see 106 is accounted for in terms of 2022. Okay, and so what did we see happening in this year? And Osnet had made some reference to it. So in February, we started off the year with the earthquake that happened in Turkey. Almost 50,000 people had lost their lives in that earthquake. In 2023, the US tornadoes, almost 1,300 tornadoes. I mean, I couldn't even get my head around that. They record 75 deaths, but they record a whole lot more in terms of the number of people that's impacted. In May, we see the cyclone in Bangladesh, which recorded almost 463 deaths. In China, the floods, the Moroccan earthquake, Libya. Some of the reports that came through had placed the number of deaths at about 20,000, but sort of official figures were sitting at 11,300. And just yesterday was the earthquake in Afghanistan. And already we're seeing that there's about 320 deaths that's been recorded, and they anticipate that this will be increasing as we go along. Part of the reason why I put this in is because I think you're starting to see a pattern in terms of the impact of climate change on our environment. And it really is a call to action for each one of us, that it's not something that's happening to someone else. It's in our own space. I think Osnet was just sharing with us that there was an earthquake where she lives as well. And, it becomes part of our natural way of being that we deal with these issues. But I think part of the call to action today is about responding, but mindfully. So we know that we can't prevent all of these things. However, we can respond more mindfully. And today's conversation is really about just setting the stage for that kind of mindfulness in terms of preparedness. So when you think about preparedness, there was quite a lot of things, and I think you can Google a whole lot of different things that that you can do. But today's conversation is about preparedness, what can happen. And we're starting to find that this issue around climate change is being addressed on a number of platforms. I think it was last month that the UN independent expert Claudia Mahler had produced a report that looked at the impact of climate change on older persons, and that report is available online as well. I really would encourage people to have a look at it, because she contextualizes very nicely all of the legal frameworks within which we can operate. She also contextualizes what are the different types of environmental disasters that older people are having to face, but also what can be done. So From a lobbying and advocacy point of view, there's certainly some instruments that we can call on in terms of being able to address that. But on a sort of a broader level, what are some of the things we need to be thinking about? So the first one is around an emergency communication plan. So as a person who is working in this field, but also as people who come into contact with other older people, we need to have conversations around what does an emergency communication plan look like? If there's an emergency, who do you need to communicate with? Do you know how to use all of these communication platforms? So these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about. Identify and list the emergency contacts, including family members, friends, neighbors, and healthcare professionals. Have that accessible at a place that is easy to access and easy to utilize in terms of emergency. Also, to ensure that our older persons are educated in terms of how to use emergency alert systems and communication devices. So within, for example, TAFTA, we have these early warning systems. So if there's an emergency, the alarm can be set off and we know what we need to do. However, do older people know how to utilize this? And this really talks to the issue around evacuation plans and drills and those kinds of things. And we really have to get very serious about these aspects as well. The next thing is around having an emergency kit for older persons. Again, if you Google, you'll find a whole lot of different things that you can put into this kit, from essential supplies, non-perishable foods, medication, flashlight, whatever. So I really would encourage you to have these conversations in your spaces about what a kit would look like that is relevant for wherever you are. The next is to look at your support network, establishing your support network. So encouraging older persons to connect with community organizations so that they start developing those networks, identifying who are the volunteers who can check on older persons and provide assistance if that's needed. Also developing partnerships with local authorities, with NGOs and healthcare providers so that we can ensure there's a coordinated response for older persons. This helps with the preparedness. So when there's an emergency, you've already created these support networks. The next is to conduct emergency preparedness training. And these are for people, all stakeholders, whether it is older persons, whether it is service providers, looking at self-help techniques, whether it's basic first aid, fire safety. We need to engage with people so that they know how to respond when they are placed in a highly emotional situation. The other is to also consider transportation needs, and this is a big thing. I think when we had the floods in Durban, most of our roads were impacted. And it really became a problem in terms of how do you transport people from one place to the other. Our floods were also followed by the riots that we had in KwaZulu-Natal in July, and that also impacted on our supply chain, on our roads. But the issue around transportation, how do you get older people from one place to the other, was something that we needed to be thinking about. So I think in terms of preparedness, we need to be thinking about identifying who the transportation resources could be, who can we collaborate with, and ensuring that older persons are are aware of what transportation is available and how to access that. The next thing is to also prioritize healthcare services. And here it's about coordinating with healthcare providers. Within our context in Durban, we have a number of volunteer organizations, the medical associations who constantly reach out wanting to help. But we need to put in place all of these network systems. So in the case of emergency, we just activate rather than trying to set up protocols at that point in time. And then the issue around psychological support becomes quite important as well. So today I just wanted to, Osnetsi, I've done it in 26 minutes, so I'm keeping to your 50-50. I'm really trying to keep to time. But today I really just wanted to set the scene about, what we can do. I think when I start reflecting on all the disasters that's happening all around us, I don't want us to be overwhelmed by the enormity of what we're dealing with. I really want us to be inspired to act and to be part of the solution. And I'm hoping that part of the conversation will be about solutions that make sense in your space. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. All right, Osnet, so at this point, I will invite any questions or comments.
So before we get there, something that struck me, and thank you very much for showing the numbers and the scope of everything. And it struck me, especially in the last list of preparedness steps, is that there are two contexts here. One is the personal. So it's a question to all of you. Do you have a plan? Do you have a plan for yourself of what to do in case disaster or crisis hits, or one of those slow boiling disasters, increasing heat? And the other context is the community that you're in. And it's not necessarily the government will get there eventually, but in the preparedness, the immediate preparedness is for the people you know, to the people around you, to the people you care for. Some of us here are part of organizations that do that work in the community, and some of us are individuals who do that work for ourselves, but know people who could benefit from that level of preparedness. So I wanted to just make a distinction between these two contexts. And now, indeed, we're going to open the microphone to anybody who wants to share an insight, ask a question, make a proposal, tell about your own community. And so please, Valerie, let us know
what struck me about that list was that it isn't really to do with climate change, it's to do with our lives as they are now. And actually, it's a very good idea. I'm 82, and I suppose I should have thought of all of that, but I didn't. So I think it's a good idea. And if you could share that slide to everyone as a reminder, that would be a great help.
Beg your pardon. I was thinking about Femada and the two major flooding incidents that she's had. And the fact that I think what's so extraordinary about her work, which is if I just want them to know the scale of your responsibility, Femada. As I remember, it was something like 1,900 people who live in your public housing. And in that complex, and you, as the director, you're responsible for this enormous number. I remember you're showing how when you opened the door of your office that there wasn't any sidewalk, there wasn't any land there. It was just eroded by the water that had taken it out. Just so dramatic. But my sense is that you already have such an extraordinary community network developed that is so significant. And you mentioned support network, but particularly with you have the kind of scale of responsibility that some of you have, I think that history of building community is powerful. I did want to just add one thing to that list, though. We have been talking here about environmental disasters, but I also think that there's the potential for economic disaster. And for example, here in the US, if there are a government shutdown, which is still a risk that will be coming up again this month, what happens when you stop getting your Social Security payment and your medical care payments, etc.? What do you do when the banks fail? Which is what happened to people back here in 1929. The banks there was no money there. So the economic piece, I think, is another potential disaster where what you had counted on being in the bank or coming in through the mail, for example, simply is not there. And it seemed to me that you had that problem also with South Africa payments that weren't there. I can't imagine what you could have done with that. So I think that these just you exemplify just extraordinary leadership for having dealt with these things and coming out the other end. My bet is that it's that community network, staff network, the resident network that made the difference. Networking. That's it.
Thank you, Jen. I wanted to mention something that when we spoke with Femada, we made a conscious decision to speak primarily about environmental disasters because they hit immediately and everything else comes after. And we decided to leave the conversations about conflict areas, economic, all kinds of other things that are not hitting instantly to another conversation. And so that's another distinction between what can you do to prepare for the moment and what can you do to prepare for the medium and long range. And Femada, I just want to pass it back to you if you can respond maybe to Jen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jen, for your kind words. Absolutely. I think there's been just a multitude of challenges that we are facing across the world. I think not just in South Africa, but across the world. And as Osnet rightly said, when we were planning for this particular session, we said, okay, we really want to think about things that are within our control immediately, things that we can leave this session and put into action in our personal lives and in our communities as well. So it really should spur on a sort of call to action in terms of what we can do. But I think that the issues that you raised, Jana, are very relevant issues. And I think we must keep the conversations going around the different things that impacts on our lives. I mean, within the South African context, we're having elections next year. So, we're obviously concerned about how that will impact on older persons and the lives of older persons, and how do we prepare for that? So there's multitude of different conversations that need to happen. But I think for people from the Pass It On network, I was saying to Moira and Osnet before we started, every time I have a conversation, I learn something new and I find something else that I can sort of, consider and delve into. That's the value of this network. And Moira very nicely described it in a metaphor at one of our meetings where she says the Pass It On network is like a well, where people come in and put things into the well, and others come and take things off that well as they need it. And I think that's the conversation we want to have. Let's add our wisdom around preparedness in times of environmental disasters, and let you take away some of these seeds that we plant and let that flourish within your own context as well.
That's so beautiful. Thank you, Femada. Brian, what can you share with us?
What I was thinking, picking up sort of Myra, that learning to do this now is building civility. It's building the ability to work together, because looking at the data that we have, the progression of the disasters suggests that there's going to be food shortages, that there's going to be, I would even guess, class distinction is one of the things that the long run, but that building what you're talking about now might give us hope that we'll have that in place rather than the dystopia that so many predict.
I'd be interested to also hear, I hear you, Brian, and that's correct. I'd also be interested to hear what additional things can we put in that we haven't considered. So if you think about disaster preparedness within your context, if I had to say to you, think about what you would like to do today, what sort of immediately pops to your mind? What's some of the things that you can do? Because I firmly believe in we must be part of the solutions and we must be proactive. So, what are some of the wisdom that we can share with each other?
Since I'm still there with the hand up, I'll say intergenerational.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge one. I think of scouting and whatever else might still be out there, even putting it in part of schools, civics and such.
This is interesting that you're saying it, Brian. And I was watching the quilt of faces that we have here. And the moment you said intergenerational, everybody who has their photo on, with camera on, nodded vigorously. And it really, it seems like it really strikes a chord. And after Valerie speaks, maybe on that, I'd be very interested to hear from some other people who haven't spoken yet. Valerie, go ahead.
Definitely on that, because that's what Learn with Grandma is all about. It's about intergenerational learning. We older people have skills and knowledge which we can pass on, and the younger people can share their technical skills with us. I was 50 when Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, and believe me, I think I can always do with some more skills on the IT side. And this communication tool that we have now is just so incredible. Here we are talking to people all over the world, sharing skills and knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Profound. In your communities, for yourself, what's happening?
Osnet, I see Tom has put a comment in the chat box as well. Maybe he'd like to talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, working with the various faith communities. Faith communities are often, usually, maybe always, committed to helping their neighbors, and maybe they are already, and maybe they would want to do more or would need to be informed about what could be done.
Absolutely.
It's interesting what you're saying. There's some help that comes from the heart, and as we see more and more, there's some preparedness that has to be a little bit more structured and premeditated, pretty much creating a network of support. And then I want to pass it back to Femada. How do you describe the distinction between the two, and how can the two be integrated?
Sorry, Osnet, I didn't get that.
So the distinction between help that comes from the heart, yes, we're all part of the same community. So if we see somebody who needs help, we'll help them. And the need to actually have a structure and infrastructure of organized preparedness in case of something happens.
Yeah, I think the two they don't necessarily have to be separate, but I do think that one perhaps supports the other. So having the structure enables you to work from the heart, because I think that when we see people in an emergency situation, it's sort of natural inclination to want to help. However, if you have the systems in place, if you have the infrastructure, there's a familiarity in terms of what you need to do. It's almost like you go into an automatic mode of helping, but because you are familiar with what process you've set in place already in terms of infrastructure, the two work together. So I think that having that framework enables you to do to express your humanity. So I think the two would work together, not necessarily apart.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I, Verna, could I put you on the spot for a minute? You live in an intentional community. Can you describe to us what if you have something in place for that, especially in Colorado?
I was going to discuss the Marshall Fire that happened here. I have to have a discussion about our plan because I don't know. I know something's there and I don't know how intricate. For example, when two towns were literally burning down, we got a call from an aging community saying, "Can you take us in?" So we immediately had to move into providing food and beds and clinical staff to help that community. So there must be some connection. They knew who to call when they were escaping. So, but that can be refined. One of the things I wanted to mention was dealing with shock, because people couldn't function because firemen couldn't put out the fire because of the high winds. I mean, we were in a state of paralysis. And so I think looking at the psychological at the very initial step, and I think Femada dealt with that somewhat, if there's a plan, but even so, I mean, you had people running to escape that didn't have time to put their shoes on. So it's an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. So I think you need to think about who are your decision makers and have a discussion about shock levels and how you're going to manage that. Because the other thing I wanted to mention, I don't want to take too much time, but we couldn't even begin to imagine the massive numbers of transportation units that we needed. I mean, there were aging communities emptying out, hospitals. I mean, and of course you had a major traffic jam. So people couldn't even go there in worst case scenario. This was too much to even imagine. So it's just such an important discussion, you know, this idea that it can't happen to me.
Yeah. Can I maybe just respond to that quickly? I see Brian's hand. Vanna, thank you so much for bringing that up. But I think perhaps that's one of the things that I should have added on the list as well. In terms of preparedness, is being able to identify the potential hazards within your context. Osnet, I think about, you know, our conversation about the earthquakes where you live. I think part of preparedness is identifying the potential hazards. Identify the types of disasters or emergencies that are most likely to occur in your area, whether it's wildfires, whether it's hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods, and then developing a deeper understanding of the potential hazards will help you prepare better. So if you know that within your context, there is the likelihood of the wildfires, then your conversation will be around that. So maybe that should have been something that I put on the list as well. Just start off by identifying the potential hazards and create space for conversation. And it can be as simple as what if? What if we had an earthquake that really impacted significantly? What would we need to do? And just create space for that kind of dialogue.
Very wise. In fact, after this call today, Femada will help us put together a more up-to-date list, which will also be included in our follow-up note in the highlights of today's conversation. Brian, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I see. when you talked about infrastructure, I suddenly, at least in this country, every county has a disaster plan. And to find the people like the Red Cross and like the counties and such as to what they already have in place and get into the conversation with them so that they're aware of what you're of the elders, making sure that they're thinking that way as well. I think that's when you talked about infrastructure. Oh yeah, almost there's lots of people, lots of things that are well versed in responding to disasters. So we just need to converse with them, I think.
You're very astute by promoting here also the pointing out to the personal responsibility of creating your own plan. My own plan might be knowing who to call when I need help. The community plan might be having the help there to give me when I need it.
Yeah.
Any other comments from people we haven't heard from?
See, Moira's hand is up as well.
Oh yeah.
I'd just like to ask a question of everybody around here, and it goes back to what Brian was saying earlier about the intergenerational aspect. To what extent are schools preparing children for disasters? Do you know, in South Africa, for example, is there sort of a preparedness? Because the children are also involved and they can help and need not to panic, that kind of thing. Everybody's got a school system. The systems, are they involved in this? I remember seeing films from Japan where the little kids, tiny little kids, are taught to climb under tables, in case there's going to be an earthquake. They were taught and they were conditioned to be aware and to respond.
It's not something I'm aware of. Linda, maybe in terms of your work with ECD?
I'm not aware. I've been out of the school system for a very long time, and it is possible that in some schools they have plans, but my gut is, like for most of us, that we have to produce the plan on the run because we haven't prepared for these kinds of things individually or community-wise. So I think that for me is the big takeaway today is, what will happen if.
Sure.
I was sharing with Femada and Moira earlier before the call started that last night we had a slightly more pronounced earthquake here. And even though we have a emergency bag and whatever, I wasn't thinking fast enough. I wasn't thinking, should I put my shoes on? Well, let's wait a couple more minutes. But some of these things have to be automatic as far as my own preparedness, and also know what I can do in case, what are the local resources that I have available in case that happens. And we get into this kind of complacency quite easily. Jeff.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is, as we're talking, we all on this call, we have a vested interest in older adults and what needs to happen in terms of promoting their safety in these situations. What about the people who are not engaged in this, who need to be educated about the importance of including plans for their older populations? I'm just wondering, for example, people who are isolated and alone, it's a major issue, obviously, across the globe. How are we identifying them, for example? Who's looking out and seeing, well, Jesus, who's living in that house? How do we identify those people? There was a program in Colorado and Denver at one point, where the mailmen were educated about who they were delivering the mail to, and being able to look out for people who, if they didn't get their mail in a few days or what have you, that there was somebody who looked in on them. I'm just wondering, how do we go about identifying more individuals or more groups that could be engaged in this if they were aware that, hey, this is an issue? And how do we reach out to them? That might be part of what would be helpful to me.
But the conversation's moved on, so, and having missed part of it, I just wanted to comment about what happens in schools, because that's where my experience is. So, and I wanted to say, unfortunately, in the United States, having been an educator my entire career, although I'm in Canada, we also have preparations for various things. But in the United States right now, the primary concern are school shootings, and little children as young as 4 and 5, unfortunately, are being taught where and how to hide. And that's one of the first drills they go through in schools. Frightening.
Yeah.
Sure, it's awful.
Femada, you
Yeah,
wanted to
yes, I just want to add maybe 1 or 2 comments. One is I'm just reflecting on what you were talking about, Osnet, about, should I put my shoes on? Should I grab my bag? Maybe part of the plan needs to be an identification of what are the triggers. When this happens, then I need to do this, because we wait and we are in shock. I think there was someone who spoke about we get paralyzed when we are in that situation. So I think the preparing for certain scenarios means that we have conversations around that. So what would be the trigger? How would I know that when the cups are rattling, my shoes must go on? It's about identifying what are those triggers, and that has to be a conversation that you have with maybe people in your support network. So if you're living in a block of flats and you have, I don't know, we call it a residence committee or whatever, a body corporate or whatever it is, and say, okay, how can we identify what would be the triggers for action? And just spend 5 minutes brainstorming that, and you'll come up with some wild and wonderful suggestions, I would think. So maybe that's something to think about. I also want to reflect back on what Werner was saying about the psychological aspect and the shock that people go through. We recently had a fire in one of our buildings, and we had to evacuate all the people in the building. And that issue around the shock and how it paralyzes people is such a real issue. And I think part of preparedness is to have conversations about that. So in a situation where we have these environmental disasters, we can anticipate that we're going to be feeling this way. So if you prepare people for what they're feeling, for what they can feel, they'll be able to identify it quickly, and that may spur their action further. So I remember when we were speaking to some of the older people after the fire, the one lady held onto my hand and she said, is it going to be safe for me to go back to my room? And just saying to her, it's okay. I know you're scared, and it's natural that you're feeling this way. And these are some of the things we're going to do to keep you safe. Visibly calmed her down. And these are some of the things and tools that we need to be able to build capacity with a number of different stakeholders. So whether you're a service provider, whether you're a community member, those things are important. And the last point I think that Jeff brought up now around how do we take care of those people who are not engaged in the space? I think, we need to look at some creative way of mapping where older people are. So from the South African perspective, we have community policing forums, which are made up of a number of different stakeholders. I think perhaps we should look at other civic bodies as well, or civic structures, that can help support older people. It could be an intergenerational activity or an initiative where you have youth who are wanting to be engaged, whether it's via the scouts or whatever structures. Just have those conversations and say, okay, how do we map where older people are in this community? And what does support of older people in times of disaster look like? What can you do? It could be that someone will say, okay, I can get across the road quicker than a family member would, or it can be anything. I think just having those kind of conversations is important.
I want to add to this. In buildings, at least where I used to work when I was in a corporate, we had every couple of months we had a fire drill. We will practice how to evacuate the building. We knew where the exit signs are. There was somebody who was responsible for the floor, whatever. And one day there was a fire, and we all knew what to do. And practicing your preparedness plan. So I don't have to ask myself, should I put my shoes on, or should I check on the internet whether there was just an earthquake here, which is what I actually did, would be a little bit more automatic and maybe save my life or save my neighbor's life. Valerie is holding a card. She was mentioning before that there is a graphic card, I guess, from her community that shows that is given to everybody, right, Valerie? And everybody knows how to find stuff, help?
Yes. Actually, it didn't get very far because at that time we were printing on bits of paper. But nowadays, of course, I need a new graphic. But this was something similar that you could look at. It was about what if Grandma and Granddad fall down? How to get help. So basically, I know you can't see it very well, but a new graphic with this kind of information, basic and simple, it could be done in sent across the line. And I think now something that is the size of a credit card, so that it can be kept in people's handbags, in people's pockets, so that they always know, and in school bags and so on, so they always know who to call. In fact, we could call it who to call.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
I don't know how I can send it to you, Moira, but because it's an old thing that I did ages ago, but certainly at the time it helped, and the police funded it. But really nowadays we don't need funding if we use the internet.
Right. That's
Just
providing our
Providing
communication
internet.
systems have not been demolished by the disaster. Yes. Any other thoughts? This was a lot. I mean, I just took myself a whole bunch of notes here of things that I haven't thought about, and maybe you have too. And we're kind of wrapping up now, and maybe this is a good time to ask, knowing what you know now after the conversation today, what is the one small thing that you could do for yourself or for your community, maybe even this evening or tomorrow morning?
what I'm doing.
It was not a rhetorical question. It was an actual question, and I hope that you have some comments about it. Verna, are you clapping, or you're going to say something?
I don't know if I'm clapping or what I'm doing. I never know what I'm doing. I'm getting an email out immediately to my CEO and director and asking them these questions. Because I think it's time that we, like you have war games, I think you need to have environmental crisis games and just figure out all the worst case scenarios and all the possibilities and just lay it out.
Yeah.
Simple.
Everybody else is cool?
No, I'm not. This is Moira. I'm going to ask OldUp, the association here in France, to make a formal inquiry and to produce a document of what people should do, because there are a lot of, Red Cross services and whatever, but I'm not sure that we will have the right information to know who to contact in case of a disaster.
We have Suzanne saying that having a personal plan, such value in taking away the feeling of helplessness in crisis. And Jeff says, I can find out if we have an emergency plan at the city or county level that specifically spells out what's being done for elders. Good advice from Valerie, keep it simple. Brian, what's happening there in Minnesota for you?
Write instead of talk. When I worked in hospitals, we would regularly have disaster drills, which included the firefighters and the police. And the hospital would have a scenario and people would volunteer to be victims. And so, there'd be all the kind of, as somebody said, we disaster games. And so I don't know if that was just here or if that's everywhere. Who does that?
What a good question. What a good question. I want to throw a couple other questions here beyond what would you do differently as a result of today, is also what surprised you? What did you notice that you did not know before? And what would you do differently as a result of what you heard it today?
The disaster slide was just, 10 years versus 1 year. It was just overwhelming.
Myrna?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to say, based on today's conversation, I never thought about the shock, the immediate shock of some disaster. And it leads me to believe that the most important thing on a personal basis is to know what to do and to be prepared in the immediate circumstance of a disaster, and then to have a kit ready, which I have done. But to think about the immediacy of doing something is something that we have to keep in the forefront of our minds. That's my response.
Almost train for it, so you don't have to think about it. And
yes,
the shock does not, even if the shock kicks in, your body knows what to do next.
Yes. I think that is so important.
We are almost at the formal ending time, and there are a few things that I want to mention here before we thank Femada, is that this is a pause and parenthesis. Sometime in the next few days, probably the end of the week, you'll receive a follow-up mail with highlights of what we spoke about today, with some links and other helpful tips. And there'll be a link to the recording in that highlight mail, and the recording will be on our YouTube channel, Pasto Network. And I wanted to invite you to November. We have a special guest. Her name is Bridget Sleep, and she's from Human Rights Watch. Some of you know her. And she's going to share with us recent research on topic of age discrimination. And the most important thing, this is our opportunity to also help her in her research and direct in which direction it's going to go. She wants to know what are the important issues in age discrimination, and who knows it better than the people of Pass It On Network. So I invite you to come back on November 13th, same time, different link, you'll receive an invitation, and help promote and direct quality research on age discrimination. And we are, in a moment, we're going to close formally and leave the session open for another 15 minutes until half an hour after the hour. For those of you who want to say more or speak about some other important topics, I want to thank Femada for bringing up such an important conversation, important issue. And some of us here are probably dumbfounded because we haven't thought about all that stuff, and now we do, and we're going to immediately after this call go and do something about it. And I leave you, Femada, to say the last few words about the content of the session today.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Osnet, and I'm very grateful to the Pass It On Network as well for picking up this conversation and heeding my call to action when I posted on LinkedIn that we need to do something. So I'm just so grateful for this network that impacts on the lives of people. So I'm thankful. But I think for all of the participants who shared ideas and who made some very useful comments, it does inspire me to think a little bit differently also for myself personally, but also in terms of the organization that I'm part of, so that we are a little bit more prepared. I would just encourage everyone to just continue to be curious and look for ways in which we are part of the solution. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you. Moira, do you have any parting words for the official part of the call?
The official part. No, seriously, I think it was an extremely interesting conversation. There's so many things that I think that are out there that we haven't defined or haven't put our finger on the issues, and maybe in our gazette we can start listing some of the things or doing some stories about this particular. As I mentioned, I'm going to find out what actually is in place in Paris or in France for this kind of thing, and then also find out whether there is a specific aspect relating to older people, or if it's just more general. And I've always thought that we could do and should do training of older people for disasters, not so much for older people who are totally valid and can play a role, obviously not in the front lines, but maybe at the back, maybe looking after children or helping other people. But I think that's something that needs to be thought about and put into place. So Femada, you're a star as always. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
I have to tell you that as we were speaking about all the things that we could do, and I'm thinking of my own context, and I'm finding that I'm so unprepared. I thought I was, and in fact I'm not, and my heart is pounding with a semi-panic. And I'm saying, what if tonight is not going to be 4.2 Richter earthquake, but it's going to be higher? And here's Myrna, who lives just a few blocks from me, and she probably felt it too. And even though I have all the stuff prepared, I did not act on it. And this conversation definitely helped me rethink what should be my first item when the next thing will happen.
Yeah. So, Asnet, what were you waiting for?
We have so many earthquakes every day that it's almost hard to gauge what the level. All of them are very low level, and this one was a little bit low, a little bit higher. You could actually feel it. Myrna, did you feel it?
Yes. I did not feel it, but yes, aware.
So you don't know if this is the prelude for the big one or not. The big one is the one that's going to destroy the entire West Coast. Overdue, as they say. So what was I waiting for? I think I was complacent. I mean, when I feel something like this, instead of looking at my partner and saying, "Was that an earthquake or a washing machine?" Is to run and put the shoes on and and stick some things in my pocket and take my bag and say, if the one in 5 minutes is something bigger, we should be ready for it. And it's not a reflex for me, and it should be.
Do you have your passport in that bag?
No, actually, my bag has things to survive on. It has one of those memory sticks that has all my documents on it. And but my shoes are not next to my bed, and because a lot of times these things happen in the middle of the night. But this was like 6 o'clock in the evening, so what might that be? But yeah, it needs to be a reflex to just grab it and go.
Yeah. So in South Africa, because we have a high crime rate, it's terrible, but we have these issues around hijacking, and so you kind of teach your kids that there's a word. So my daughter, I would say, if you hear this word in the car, irrespective of whatever, you stop, and this is how you need to behave. So you kind of have a trigger word. So that if we are ever in a hijacking situation, she needs to know that she must just act, because she's a curious child. She wants to ask me 20 questions before she, decides to do something, as little kids are. But we have this conversation around, this is the word. If you hear this word, I don't want you to ask me any questions. This is what you need to do. But, being able to identify what the trigger is. And so we had conversations around, at that point, mom knows best. So you just listen to mom. That's it, So maybe that's part of it, being able to identify what hence I was saying, if the cups rattle, or like if there's an intense earthquake, something should happen, whether it's a sound or something, that sort of just alerts you. You must be able to identify it almost immediately, like, oh, that's that's my wine glasses that are rattling. So it means that's intense. So I need to run, whatever it is. So maybe just, have some fun around thinking about the possible.
Yeah.
And the more ridiculous it is, the more likely you will remember it. So yeah, maybe that's something to think about as well.
That's so interesting. We are so triggered by so many different things, and we can create our own intentional trigger to create the next life-saving act.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was going to comment that there are books out there on basically being prepared for all sorts of different disasters. And so, one is how to survive anything. And so they've created the checklist for those of us who may not think of some of those things. And the other thing, I was going to say, somebody mentioned faith communities. Almost every faith community would have training available to the pastor on trauma, on responding to shock and such.
Osnet, thank you for the key. I haven't done that, but I will do that from now on. Have all my vital documents, including my identity documents and precious documents, on a key and a stick, and put that in my go away bag.
Well done.
That's very helpful.
That's a good idea.
Wasn't on?
Yes.
Femada's comment was incisive that we need to have these conversations with our family and our housemates on what we are going to do for those of us that live with others. You know, my wife is she's the queen of disaster here in queen of disaster preparedness here in Manoa Valley, above the University of Hawaii. There's a disaster preparedness organization, Be Ready Manoa. So, getting back to your point, we have to walk the talk. So, quite some years ago, and we constantly maintain it, is we have 2 weeks of drinking water and two weeks of food, 2 meals a day. The meals ready to eat. Granted, we have the storage space, and not everybody has the storage space for this, but we have the storage space, and it's a big one-time outlay. Right, you need money to buy this 2 weeks of supplies, and for us in Hawaii, it's a 2 weeks supply, because the food sources here in Hawaii, it's just on island, it's just a three-day supply. It's predicted that food in a disaster will be exhausted in 3 days before airlifts begin bringing in food. And also, Femada, the other incisive point is you do need to examine this. What is the most likely disaster? I live on Oahu, and a wildfire like the Maui wildfires is unlikely. But what is more likely in our valley would be floods, either from rains or hurricane. I mean, if a hurricane came, there'd also be high winds, down trees, and all of that. But floods was the most recent disaster here. So what are you going to do really depends where you are in the valley. A lot of us are just going to stay in place if we're on higher ground. So that isn't incisive. I mean, because it's hard to prepare for all disasters.
Yes, you can't.
It's what is most likely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So thank you for letting me join you all today.
Good. Can I maybe can I do a follow-up comment to what you're saying, Gary? I think you're absolutely correct. We can't prepare for everything, but I think the truth is what you say it is. So if you prepare for one disaster and you have sort of steps that you can follow, and there's something else that comes in that you haven't prepared for, but you define that as a disaster, then you use the same steps. So it's by association. So it's about what you've prepared for and the narrative that you put forward. So, for example, I have prepared for floods in Durban, South Africa. We now have a fire, but I'm using the principles of preparedness. And my conversation with the older people is we've prepared for floods. We use the same steps. It's a disaster, same steps for the fire. So by association, you just define it differently and you own that narrative around you can do this because we know how to identify this. It's the same steps. We follow the same steps, that kind of thing. So I think in kind of disaster preparedness, it's about the narrative as well. And I think that's what I found when we were dealing with the fire in July. The truth is what you say it is. People want to hear from you what's happening. And sometimes that's where the anxiety lives, and that's where people get very anxious. They make these assumptions around what's happening. And in that moment, it seems like 2 hours. When I did sort of the debrief with our older people, I actually went through it step by step. And I said, okay, the fire happened at this time. In 5 minutes, we responded. Here's the footage, you can see. And in 5 minutes, so that narrative was, we got this, guys. We responded. And the anxiety levels came down. But yeah, I think you just have to own that narrative and get people past that immediate paralysis. And it's an interesting dynamic around helping people through disasters, I think. Though the fire wasn't natural, wasn't environmental. The fire wasn't environmental. It was an old TV that blew up. But yeah, so we have interesting times. I think the universe thinks I'm bored and sends me all of these things just to test me.
You passed with flying colors. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Super.
Yeah.
Well, we are at time. We made it without any extraordinary incidents, and we learned so much today. Thank you again, Femada, for going through all the power limitation, turning on generators and all this other stuff there to be with us. Really appreciate it. Please come back in November for our next 50-50 conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. This has
Thank
been
you.
very.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Very important discussion.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.